Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as we talk about ultralights, remote ID, and drones, and how lessons learned from what happened to ultralights could be applicable to drones and RC model airplanes as we deal with the FAA regulations and remote ID. There is pretty strong linkages. Let's get to it. How in the world, you might be asking, will ultralights, drones, and FAA regulations in any way be connected? There actually is a pretty strong correlation. What the ultralight community went through about 40 years ago compared to what drones or unmanned small aircraft are going through today, with registration, remote ID, and various restrictions on the flight being imposed. And I think it's useful to see how the ultralight community treated this situation with the FAA back in the early 1980s compared to what we're going through today with our drones, specifically with remote ID. I think the key takeaway on this is with the FAA, because they're busy doing a lot of stuff. If your community in the world of aviation is pretty much taking care of themselves, they have some sort of organization that represents your interest, and you by and large stay out of trouble, the FAA will give you a surprising amount of leeway to let you pursue your flying without too much of regulatory oversight. I think this is of benefit as the drones and RC models go into the brave new world of remote ID and the beginning of FAA regulation and the potential of further FAA regulation of our model airplane flying activities. Again, thank you for likes, subscribes, and any Facebook posts. They truly help the algorithm with the channel and allow me to do more videos on electric RC model airplanes. Let's talk a little bit about the FAA and regulations, because regulations, specifically FAA regulations, are a new thing to thousands of drone pilots just flying for the first time. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, is authorized by Congress to run the national airspace system, all movements in there. Keep in mind, the FAA has a lot going on. They control everything flying in the airspace over the United States, to include military traffic. All military traffic, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and so forth, fall under the purview of the FAA for clearances and permissions to fly and so forth. But the FAA is an organization that doesn't have enough people. They are working hard just to keep up with what they have to do. The FAA is not looking for extra work, so when extra work comes along, as we'll discuss with ultralights in the early 1980s, drones today, anything that the ultralight or today the drone community can do to assist the FAA, partner with the FAA, you're probably going to have a better outcome. And if the FAA perceives that you can police yourself, you're fairly well organized, you tend to answer questions, they will give you, as I mentioned before, a surprising amount of leeway on your operations. So just some overall observations on how the FAA approaches flying and flight safety, because everything will come back to flight safety. First of all, the FAA will put a huge distinction between recreational, private type of flying and anything involving commercial activity, especially selling tickets to the traveling public. The FAA will give a lot more leeway and freedom, latitude towards recreational flying compared to commercial flying. An excellent example of that is the part of the FAA regulations that governs three types of flying: Part 91, Part 135, Part 121. Part 91 is general operations of private aircraft, or sometimes they call it general aviation. These are the people flying their Cessnas. They own their own airplanes, perhaps. They rent. They just fly for their own fun. They don't make any money on it. They're purely non-commercial flight. This is under Part 91. Part 135 is scheduled air taxi. Part 121 is scheduled air carrier. Think Delta, United Airlines. So just to show you how the FAA treats these two groups, if you're a Part 91 flyer with your Cessna or whatever plane you're flying in general aviation, there is no age limit to be a pilot. If you can pass an FAA medical, you can be a Part 91 pilot. However, on Part 121, scheduled air operations, there is a mandatory retirement age of 65, no matter how healthy you are. So just an example of how commercial versus private aviation, just an example of a regulation difference. Regarding safety for flying, this is going to sound a little bit harsh or mean, but the FAA, in a very general sense, does not care if you kill yourself so long as you don't kill other people in the process, either passengers, customers, or people on the ground. And this is a useful insight for the ultralight industry, because you'll see that in the ultralight industry that if you want to injure yourself as an ultralight pilot, there's a lot of planes where you can do this. The FAA is going to let you do that, just not anyone else in the process of doing that. And you'll see that by the design rules for ultralights and the operating rules where they are allowed to fly. Let's talk a little bit about ultralights. What are ultralights? Well, the ultralights are covered by a regulation written in 1984, which we'll discuss how that came about on ultralight operations. It's called Part 103 of the FAA regulations. And they define an ultralight is if it's unpowered, it has to weigh less than 155 pounds. Think a hang glider. If it's powered, it has to weigh less than 254 pounds. That's the definition of ultralight. If you weigh more than 254 pounds, then you're in different categories of experimental aircraft, registration, pilot certificates, and so forth. So hang gliders were really the very first way that man flew aircraft. Remember, what allowed the Wright brothers to succeed where they did? They were really the first ones to develop a practical lightweight engine. Before that, there were a lot of people flying gliders, essentially hang gliders. Otto Lilienthal in Germany in the late 19th century. Even the Wright brothers did a lot of hang glide flying to practice flying their aircraft before they could get their engine to work. So hang gliders were a thing since the earliest days of flight. As materials improved and they became lightweight and just easier to use, they became a hobby. And so in the 1970s, there was more and more hang glider activity in places that lent itself to that activity, coastal areas in California and the East Coast, where you had favorable winds, open areas like beaches. There was a lot of hang gliding activity. So pretty much the first ultralight happened in the late 1970s. An engineer from Ohio named John Moody took an Icarus hang glider and he put one of these new lightweight two-cycle engines onto his hang glider. So now there's an airplane flying, it's a hang glider, there's a person in it, but it's got a motor and it's flying in the National Airspace System. So these aircraft started to develop, get a little bit bigger, have rudimentary cockpits, landing gear, and so forth. So now there's a whole class of aircraft being built by home builders in the National Airspace System, but there's no regulatory oversight at all. Again, you can kind of see how this can parallel what's happening with drones and remote ID. There's a whole new class of aircraft flying in the National Airspace System, going a lot of places. What does the FAA do, if anything? So getting back to the ultralights, what the FAA did back in 1982, they formed working groups. In this case, an Aviation Rulemaking Advisory Commission, and they invited other groups that were knowledgeable in ultralight operations, because the FAA wasn't. They used such groups as the United States Ultralight Association, the U.S. Hang Gliding Paragliding Association, to advise the FAA to write the first set of regulations for these, what were then called ultralights under Part 103. They did so, and 2 years later, the FAA published a Part 103 regulation. It's an interesting regulation because it covers a lot of aircraft, but it's only a couple of pages long. And what you'll see is, due to the nature of ultralights, they tend to organize themselves pretty well, fly quite responsibly, and the FAA determined we're going to keep this a recreational flying, so there's no passengers or any commercial activities involved. So now that they're recreational, we've got a little bit more freedom to allow them to do things. And it's surprisingly how light the regulatory touch is on these ultralight flyers. Let's discuss what is an ultralight. So an ultralight, per the FAA in the United States, is a vehicle defined by Federal Aviation Regulation Part 103, limited to the following. Single seat. That means there's no passengers involved. No matter how dangerous the airplane is, you don't put a passenger's life at risk. The pilot who's flying that aircraft that should know what he or she is doing. 254 pounds max empty weight if powered with an engine, 150 pounds max empty weight if unpowered, so it's a hang glider. Only 5 gallons of gas are allowed to be carried, so you're not going any long distances. The max speed is 55 knots. There are some airplanes that can't fly that slow. And the max power off stall speed, aerodynamic stall, is 24 knots. So what that means is the regulations have defined a small vehicle for one person, just flying low altitude for fun. not going to typically go any long distances routinely. And then there are the rules of the ultralight flying. This is all in Part 103. And so what it says right at the beginning, ultralight pilots are limited by Part 103 so they don't create a hazard to other people or property. And the way they do this, some examples, you can fly only during the daytime in your ultralight. There's no night flying. Some provisions for twilight flight, but we won't go into that now. You can only fly in uncontrolled airspace. You can fly in controlled airspace with permission. What that means is you need a radio, just talk to air traffic control like anybody else. No operation that creates a hazard to other people or property. No flights over cities, towns, or large groups of people. It'll yield the right of way to all other aircraft. You don't have a priority over anybody. And the two final things, you can only fly under visual flight rules conditions, in other words, in clear air during the daytime, and you're not allowed to fly over the clouds. You've got to have visual reference to the ground at all times. So these fairly simple, easy to understand rules allow you to fly at a wide range of places, but it limits your impact to injure other people in your flight. And the FAA goes on to say, the FAA allows ultralight vehicles to operate at any public airport that can safely accommodate the ultralight operations. What they mean is an airport can restrict ultralights if there's a lot of jet traffic, they might not see them and so forth. So I think that's pretty interesting for something as new as this to allow that to happen. The FAA further on goes that they do not limit the configuration or type that can be flown as an ultralight. Airplanes, weight shift trikes, powered parachutes, helicopters, gyroplanes, gliders, hot air balloons can all be flown as ultralights under the rules of Part 103. It says engines used must be reliable and lightweight, and that's all they say. The other thing that is to me amazing as a former commercial pilot, to fly an airplane under Part 103, listen to this, you do not need a license or a medical. You don't need a license or a medical. Now, as part of the organizations that oversee them, like the Experimental Aircraft Association, they strongly encourage some amount of lessons to safely fly these things, but there's no requirement to have either a license or a medical to fly these ultralight aircraft. As we discussed, the Part 103 came out about 1984. There was an advisory circular that gave some more information on the Part 103. Advisory circulars are not regulations. They just give more in-depth background to the FAA thinking about various aspects of what they do. And this is important for us RC model and drone pilots on how the FAA views their roles and regulation and what might come. The takeaway is if you work with the FAA in a professional fashion, you have some community-based organization like the United States Ultralight Association that can speak for the community, has some form of a safety code, some form of organization that can engage with the FAA, you're probably going to come out better. So this is what the FAA said in January of 1984 on ultralights. This is an advisory circular. Ultralight vehicle operations may only be conducted as sport or recreational activity. Okay, we know that. The operators of these vehicles are responsible for assessing the risks involved and ensuring their own personal safety. So in other words, if you hurt yourself, whatever, that's on you. And because it's a single pilot operation and you can't fly over crowds or towns with people, they're assuming that minimal people get injured on the ground. The rules in Part 103 are intended to assure the safety of those not involved in the sport, including persons and property on the surface and other users of the airspace. And this is the important takeaway. The ultralight community is encouraged to adopt good operating practices and programs in order to avoid more extensive regulation by the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, I'm not sure that's a threat or a veiled threat or a warning, but ultralights adopt good operating practices to avoid more extensive regulation by the FAA. That was written over 40 years ago. This is being filmed in July of 2023. A lot of those lines of thinking could be applied to RC model and drones, especially as drones start violating controlled airspace, which I'm going to touch upon a little bit later in the video. So I think there are some lessons that can be learned from how the ultralight people worked out with the FAA. They've 103 has been left alone for 41 years. They've just been allowed to do their own thing. There are accidents with Part 103. About 60 ultralight pilots get killed a year. God only knows how many people get injured in ultralight accidents. If you take a quick look at YouTube, you'll see any number of them. By the way, Tucker Gott is a very accomplished ultralight flyer. He's got a very good channel, thoughtful guy, thinks his way through things. There's a lot to learn on how to fly safely by looking at Tucker. And so, again, if you hurt yourself, the FAA goes, well, you kind of signed up for that, and they let you continue doing that. Now, another thing that some viewers have pointed out with ultralights, they go, well, how come the ultralights don't have remote ID? I have a lot of videos of remote ID. There are links in the description, but the purpose of remote ID for drones and RC model aircraft, the regulation does not become effective until September 16th, 2023. But in short, the FAA wants to know where drones are flying in the national airspace systems. For remote ID is some electronics added to the drone, either in the factory or through a module, where your location, speed, altitude of the drone flying is broadcast to law enforcement agencies, to include the takeoff and potentially the landing location of that drone in case some form of enforcement action is needed. The one exception to remote ID work are FRIAs, the FAA recognized identification areas. Those will typically be AMA and educational institution club airfields. Again, the FAA knows that if you're flying in an approved FRIA, they know where you are, they don't have to track you. But remote ID is a new thing to a lot of RC modelers. It's a new series of regulations, and it's a new involvement for community drone pilots that may not even know that the FAA exists. One viewer did point out to me with ultralights, they go, hey Tim, you know, there was an ultralight that flew to the, I think he said the White House back a few years ago. So that's true. There was an ultralight pilot. His name was Douglas Hughes. He actually landed on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol building back in April of 2015. He was a protester. He flew his ultralight from Maryland to the Capitol, landed on the lawns there. And he had letters addressed to every member of Congress who's complaining about some government activity. So it was a protest movement. He did get arrested, served 120 days in jail and a year on probation. But there's not too many other things like that with ultralight pilots. Now there's a lot of engine out situations, crash landings and so forth. But remember, ultralights are big, they're slow, they're noisy, they're very easy to see. There's no need for remote ID because everybody pretty much knows where they are, and they tend to stay out of controlled airspace without a clearance. So we've discussed ultralights, how they interact with the FAA, and their reward was a pretty light set of regulations, Part 103, that lets them do pretty much anything they want, and that has stood the test of time. 41 years, it really hasn't changed. So now let's fast forward to drones and RC model aircraft. As of right now, the FAA will lump together drones and RC model aircraft. That may change at some point, but that's the way it is for now. The Academy of Model Aeronautics has always been our organization for model aircraft. It's what they call, the FAA calls now a community-based organization. Community-based organizations are important because they're specifically described in the regulation for remote ID to allow things like FRIAs and so forth. And as with the ultralights, the FAA likes working with community-based organizations, so they have a trusted partner who is familiar with the operations of that section of the flying community, in this case really drones and quadcopters. So the FAA was the only thing out there since RC models really flew in the 1950s. So we've been flying RC models, fixed-wing models and helicopters later on for about 70 years with essentially minimal oversight from the FAA. The reason there was minimal oversight, the FAA knew we were flying, but we didn't cause any trouble. We, by and large, with our gas-powered models, tended to fly at local clubs. If there was an airport nearby, we would contact that airport. They understood where they were. There were procedures on where to fly. To a general extent, we kept below 400 feet, and we could see and avoid. We could see other airplanes and get out of the way. All that changed probably about 8 to 10 years ago when practical electric drones became available. Now with drones, you can literally go to a store, buy a drone, charge it. You're flying that afternoon fairly high, fairly far away, and you're incentivized to kind of go out and explore with drones because most drones carry a camera and people like to take pictures and video imagery with their drones. So as the drones started flying in more and more areas, there were local restrictions, maybe flying over crowds of people, flying in controlled airspace for sure. The FAA realized something had to be done. More importantly, Congress realized there had to be something done. The first step was around 2015 or so, when the FAA required registration for your drones. Later on, as Congress got involved in 2018 legislation, there was Part 107 for commercial drone operations, testing certificates for that. Moving along for recreational flyers, we had for the very first time a required test for recreational flyers, the trust test. And now there's a new thing called remote ID, as I described before, to identify the drone flying in the airspace, not for air traffic deconfliction purposes. ATC can't see these drones, but for law enforcement to know where a drone is flying, where it took off and landed in case there's some sort of enforcement action needed against that drone operator. Remote ID is a very new thing. It is coming in effective theoretically on September 16th of 2023. There's a tremendous amount of work need to be done. We're in July right now. We're about 2 months away from the implementation. There's really no remote ID modules in place. The FRIAs, where they can fly at your club, nothing's been authorized yet as of July 8th. And the only organizations in pretty good shape are the drone manufacturers. They had to be remote ID compliant. December 22nd, 2022, by and large, most drones being sold today for sure after September 16th will have remote ID built in. So with all that going in, drone pilots, RC pilots are kind of wrapping their head around, what do I do with this remote ID? There's a sizable number of people that says that I don't like regulations, I'm just simply not going to follow it. And that attitude is just not helpful when we're dealing with the FAA. The FAA intends, when regulations are written, that they're going to be followed, as demonstrated with the ultralight communities. So I just wanted to point out again the benefit to us as a RC modeling community to just follow regulations. And one of the biggest things are sightings reports. So if you want to see official FAA documentation reported by pilots of drones, they're pretty much all drones, violating controlled airspace, simply Google FAA UAS sightings report. And here's an example of the sighting report. They're done in quarters, 3 months at a time. This is January to March 2023, the latest one out there. If you take a look at the first week of January 2023, there were 24 reported sightings. If you multiply that 24 in 1 week out for a year, that's 1,300 violations of commercial airspace by drone pilots. And I'll just highlight too, there was a Boeing 737 flying into LaGuardia aircraft. The 737 was at 500 feet. They reported to the tower a drone 2 miles southeast of LaGuardia Airport. Think about that for a second. New York City airspace is 3 airports, Newark, JFK, and LaGuardia, so the busiest airspace in the world. You have a drone at 500 feet, 2 miles away from the landing runway at LaGuardia. Another one, again, a 737 at Santa Ana, California, Orange County Airport, again, Southern California, SoCal airspace, super busy. This is listed as a quadcopter because this quadcopter flew 100 feet above the 737 on a 7-mile final at 1,800 feet. It's beyond belief. And what I find almost amazing is that they didn't shut down the whole airspace to sort out what the heck is going on. This type of activity for our community has just got to stop. Some people have told me, well, Tim, there hasn't been an accident yet. They haven't hit an aircraft. It's the wrong answer. The FAA doesn't work that way. No safety organization works that way until after an accident to do something. They try to prevent it. And I would offer a quadcopter flying 100 feet above a 737 going 180 knots on final, configuring for a landing, is something that should be dealt with. We are not helping ourselves as a community by allowing these types of activities to continue. Thank you for joining me in this video. I appreciate having a chance to talk to you about these important subjects. My takeaway is remote ID is here to stay. As I do more and more study on unmanned aircraft operations in the U.S. and literally around the world, drones are here to stay. And because the drones, by definition, don't have people on board, they're utterly reliant upon technology to interface with existing manned aircraft where, of course, the people in the cockpit can see and avoid. You don't have that with drones. And so technologies don't even exist now are going to have to be invented to allow these safe drone operations. Because it's such a big market, I believe that will happen. Right now, remote ID is a starting point because the FAA has determined, has been supported in the courts, they need to know who is flying in the national airspace system. So it's in our interest to understand that. I think we benefit from having community-based organizations like the Academy of Model Aeronautics advocating on our behalf. If you don't negotiate with the FAA, you're going to lose. And there is more to follow on this important subject. So again, thank you for joining me, and we look forward to seeing you in future videos.